So, welcome to part 4 of our series. And in making this particular item, we're going to start with doing some detail on the door. So, I have my trusty glue and my trusty door, which I saved and have already laid out. And in the other example, I did the door a different way where I cut out each individual piece. But in this particular example, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to cut out these strips, and I've made them about the correct size for the door, which isn't even sizes. So I had to be careful and carefully lay them out. But I'm gluing together these strips on the door in the correct place that they go. And then I am gluing them down and then flipping them over. So all of these little pieces I'm using on the door to create that extra depth. And then I'll turn it over here and cut off the back side. So I am gonna eventually also put this into the unit itself, but I'm just gonna keep going with these decorative pieces. This is footage that is in a bunch of different segments because it is taken from the work day that we had in class. And so that's also why you get my headphone cord coming through the video. Sorry about that. But I just transferred the exact dimension on the bottom of the door so that I get the right size, because it's not an even size. And then I just duplicated it, so that measurement, so that it was square. And then I'll add just a little bit of glue to that. Glue it nice and tight. And I'm cutting all these pieces to fit. So I'm gluing it to fit to start, and then I'm going to flip it over and cut and trim that edge so that it's a perfect size for the door. And as I work on this door, I'm going to continue doing that all the way around. I'll use the pieces I've already cut. And in the meantime, as I work forward, I'm taking my knife and I'm scoring into the board. I'm not cutting all the way through. I'm cutting about halfway through if I can feel what that depth is. And then I'm pressing the knife into the corner and pulling up one layer of that. And then I'm just gonna peel that little layer up and take it off. So this is just one little layer of that board. And generally it's composed of several layers of paper glued together. So it will come off at a pretty consistent depth. But either way, this allows us to create layers in the door without excessive overcutting. And it's just another way to get layers. We did already cover in the last video a way to do that by cutting out a few different stepped pieces of the door in Bristol board. One of the advantages is that this allows a single layout so that we don't have to redo that layout over and over. I will also say that my glue just clogged, so I used a piece of wire on that little spool to shove the glue down and pull it back out, so I get a nice stream of glue coming out of the tip of the nozzle, so I'm able to glue evenly. Searching for a piece that's a slightly better size than what I have cut before. I cut the pieces for a couple different areas of the door, but I didn't label them, obviously. So I picked the right size, flip it over, and of course I forgot that there was glue, and so I got glue all over my mat. But I wipe it off and do that same piece again. It's worth noting that paying attention to those things will prevent you from making mistakes, but sometimes you just have to clean up your mistake and move on. So that particular door, or that particular piece, now is going to need a little cross piece between each of the cutouts. So I'm going to apply the cross piece in a long sheet. I'm going to put glue down first, and then push it up to the edge, and then either push in with my fingernail or take something sharp and metal and really drive it into that curve, and then use my knife to freehand cut it. Remember, whenever you're doing any freehand cutting without a corkback ruler, you need to be very, very careful. The knives are sharp, and every time we replace our blade, we're trying specifically to get it to be more sharp. So please be very careful. You may have to do some of these cuts without a corkback ruler, but if you're diligent, you could probably use a ruler for all of them. My lack of patience is also fueled by many years of using a knife and having some skill, the skill required to wield that knife very quickly. So, and then now I'm going to continue cutting or gluing and placing each of those individual pieces inside, as well as cutting out the voids so that I get that stepped indentation. I will say also that I'm not using a corkback ruler for these small cuts, and that is a lot because I have a longer blade, so I can have it out a little bit longer and be able to keep a nice straight line, especially in those shorter cuts. Be very careful when you're doing this digging motion, because if you're not, you could be pushing the blade willy-nilly toward your fingers. One of the most dangerous parts is when you're pressing and it suddenly releases that pressure. One of the reasons that I tell you you don't want to push until you're shaking is because when you push and it suddenly releases, when you suddenly burst through that thing that's blocking you, that's when you can often very easily hurt yourself. So I'm going to move on to the next window, the next area where I'm going to cut out that hole and pull up that paper. You want to make sure your tip gets right into the corner and can push as straight down as possible, keeping in mind that our blade isn't straight up and down. So for the rest of this, I'm looking and changing my blade because it just wasn't sharp enough. You want to make sure to change your blade regularly, and even with these snap blades, you snap off quite a bit of your blade until eventually you do have to change the whole blade. At first, the first 5 or 6 slices of your blade are very effective in cutting and very sharp, but as you get farther down and you snap off 1 or 2 pieces of blade, the 3rd and 4th piece of blade has done some cutting and has been exposed to some things that will dull it down. So you do want to keep that in mind, and you may have to break off more than 1 piece of your blade. It is helpful to look at. Sometimes you can see the dull parts of the blade. You can see the smuts, if you will, up on the metal. And that's even true with an X-Acto knife. A key part of the X-Acto knife knowing when it's dull is that you'll break the tip off those very, very quickly. And sometimes when you're cutting, you'll just hear, and that pop is the tip of your X-Acto knife breaking right off. And once it breaks off, it doesn't mean that your blade is useless. You can usually still cut with it for a little while, but you have a lot less exactness and you have to get used to where the edge of your blade currently is because it's not in the same spot. That being said, a dull blade is not useless. A dull blade can often be very useful for the parts of your project that you're just trying to score or do a cut that doesn't go all the way through. So sometimes I do keep an X-Acto knife with a dull blade hanging around right next to my knife with a sharp blade. And I'll use one when I need it and the other when I need it. So my door is done being constructed, but I'm going to go ahead and base it in white right now. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want you to be able to see the change in depth, which is a little hard to see right now with the white on white door that's going on. You won't really see that much of that depth until after we go ahead and paint the full door. But these nooks and crannies will allow you to get much more depth in the actual door in the result once you paint it. You'll be able to get darker paint deep into those crevices and have a really good time making it very detailed and interesting. All of the extra work that you put into making that door now will be useful later. Also, it's a lot harder to keep a straight line with a paintbrush than it is to keep a straight line with an X-Acto knife and a ruler at this current stage of the process. That means that you're saving yourself that time of laying that out later, and you've really only had to lay this door out once. You've had to add to it, follow that layout, and you'll continue to follow that layout as you paint it. But you've really only had to transfer the drawing once. In our other example, we transferred the drawing more than once. Now that I've finished the door, I'm going to move on to doing something else. While that door dries, I'm going to go ahead and mark out some of my molding pieces. My ground molding pieces are just short of a foot. They're about 8 to 9 inches. I think they're 10 inches. So I need to make specialty marks and go ahead and cut them out. So I went ahead and sped up that video so you don't have to watch me make those marks. And then afterward, I'm going to make small cutouts for the frame around the doors, the chair rail, etc. And that's going to be 1/4 of an inch or 3 inches in scale. So I'm going to make that kind of a scant 3 inches. It should be kind of small, but I'm going to cut out several of them because I'm going to be using this for a while. And what I'm cutting out of is cardstock, but you can use cardstock, Bristol board, or many other types of very thick paper. So for each of these molding pieces, I am going to put them down and measure them in place. These pieces I just individually line up and then mark right in the corner where they're going to go. And I usually mark the 45-degree angle. That 45-degree angle is just by hand so that I can tell which direction that 45 is going to go. And then I line it up on the cutting mat. So I'm looking at lining up usually the interior edge, whichever edge was most accurate, with exactly the corner of a square, and then lining my knife up to one of the dots on the inside so that I can get a clean 45-degree angle. Then I'll take that and some glue and glue that guy right back in where I measured him from. Now, as I do this over and over again, I do measure them to fit. And there is something to be said of being able to use measurements. But sometimes your model is just a tiny bit off, or sometimes you're trying to hide some of your messier pieces. The other thing I want to mention is that where to know where to start with your molding might be a little bit of an issue. As I line up the other side of this doorway, you might be wondering why I started with the door and I didn't start with the ground, with the baseboard, the thing closest to the bottom, the thing I cut out first. And that would be because sometimes that baseboard is not as easy to tell where it goes. Specifically, doorways go all the way to the floor and the baseboard then comes to the edge of the door. So I'm doing the doorway first. The baseboard, however, and the doorway relationship is not something I know off the top of my head. Pretty much every time I do molding, I take a look at the nearest door frame and see what the frame is doing and the ground and the baseboard is doing. What happens? Many of our answers that we have to our biggest questions about where to put molding and where to put detail is not something that we know off the top of our heads. We don't have memorized all of the architectural standards that happened in architectural history. As we use the same ones over and over, we do tend to remember them. Like a door height being a standard 80 inches or a chair being a standard 18 inches high. They're just something that I tend to remember, or some people tend to remember, the more times they look up the same information over and over again. But a door width can be anywhere from 2 feet to 36 inches or 3'6" even. So all of these standards are different, so we have to pay attention to them. Next, I'm going to go ahead and put the door in here, and all of the molding for the rest of this is done very similar. Around the window on the top and around the other window, you're going to do the same thing we did on the door frame. To put our door here, we just take a piece of masking tape and put it on the back side of the door and hinge it on one side of the door or the other. It doesn't actually matter which side of the door you put this hinge on, but by putting that piece of tape on the back, it allows it to stick, but also move open and closed whenever you'd like it to. And it's just so darn cute. All right, moving on, I want to cut out a few more skinnier pieces. And these are for the chair rail, or the picture rail, sorry. The higher molding on the wall, the tiny one. The one that we put a line under when we are tracing our walls. So I'm going to go ahead and take a line of glue and just stick it right above the pencil line that we've already marked on our surface. And that means it doesn't have to be super straight either, because we do have a little leeway underneath that molding. And that means we can glue all of this piece all at once. I'm going to take one little strip and start on the edge. And I'm going to line this up as exactly as I possibly can to the corner. And once I get to that corner, I'm going to take my knife and I'm going to gently cut. I am not going to cut this piece apart. I'm just going to score it. And once I get to this inside edge, I can use my finger and my fingernail, but I can also use anything metal, sharp, with a hard corner, like a ruler or a triangle, and go ahead and press into that corner so that I get a good firm corner in the bend of that paper. Now I'm going to place the rest of the paper across the top of that wall, very clean and even, lining it up to that pencil line as best I can. In the inside of that corner as well, I'm also, since it's an interior corner, pushing it into that corner as much as I can. But now I'm going to cut it off because it doesn't continue around the vertical piece. And that's how you can, I wouldn't say cheat, but be more efficient with your material, your time, and your space, is go ahead and run that piece of molding all the way across. And you don't have to cut them into separate pieces. Now your chair rail and some of your other pieces are pretty small sections, and you may have to cut them apart. So as I install this one, I'm going to do the same thing where I'm going to place it down and cut, but I can either cut in place or I can mark and then remove it from the interior. This is going to be a little hard for me to get stuff in, so I am going to measure and just cut out the exact size that I need. So I'm going to carefully measure that distance there. And, oh, actually, I'm not measuring. I'm actually just transferring that line down. So when I did my chair rail, I didn't actually draw that line all the way across. And I'm just transferring it down so that I can follow the bottom line for my chair rail all the way through and not have to worry about getting uneven or off kilter as I move through putting the chair rail on this particular piece. So I'm going to apply glue and then do the same thing I did before. Take my molding piece, place it down nice and firm, and then I'll go ahead and make sure it's lined up to that line very carefully off screen because I'm paying so much attention. Grab my knife and just once again make a light cut into that corner, and then I can press it around the corner. I'm going to try as much as I can to stay even with that pencil line as I move across my piece, but I need a little bit more glue, and I need to use my knife to gently cut that, score those edges so that my piece folds around that corner without difficulty. Difficulty like getting tangled in your headphone wires. So you just slice gently, and then again, gently is with a light hand. You don't want to cut all the way through. And then apply your glue and press down your piece. And then when you reach the door frame, you are going to want to cut that. So I'm actually using the blunt edge of the blade to really push into that corner before pressing it down and then cutting off the edge. Again, anytime you're cutting near your fingers without a corkback ruler, be very, very careful. As you can see, this piece moved a little because the blade is probably dull again, and I need to snap off the tip. But it is also a little soggy from the glue, so it can move around quite a bit more. Now I'm looking to see if I want to transfer that chair rail to the other wall, but I think it looks weird. So I double check my piece of paper and it doesn't go there. There's no chair rail or baseboard molding on that secondary wall. But there is some on this wall and around this corner. So I'm going to go ahead and place my little bit of extra chair rail molding in that corner, glue it down, and then wrestle with it, and then push with a hard-edged item deep into the corner. I will say that if you're having trouble with a long piece and you know, like this is a little bit shorter, sometimes that extra room can be trouble for you rather than an assistance. So you could cut off the excess and make it a smaller piece. You also could take a measurement and cut it without worrying at all about it being the same. So here I'm pushing it down. What I mean by not worrying about it being the same is you don't have to do this in one strip. You could cut this into 2 separate pieces and glue it on. That's perfectly fine and perfectly acceptable. I just like to do them as one piece because it feels a little faster, I guess. Now I'm going to do the baseboard. And this time, because the piece of paper is a lot thicker and the piece I'm using is a lot longer, it's easier for me to just hold it up and measure it and then cut it out. But it takes me a second to figure that out. So go ahead and do the short straight section first, lay it on its side and cut. And hey, look, I do remember to bring it back in frame. I should get a gold star for that. And then the other side, I just cut something close to the right measurement. I don't know that it's correct. And in fact, it is a little large. It's a little high. It's a bigger cut than it needs to be. And so I place it and push it, hold it securely, and then once again cut up against the edge of the door to make that baseboard look neat and flush. We're gonna go ahead and move to the other side of the door and cut that last little piece of baseboard. This time, I'm going to go ahead and mark with a pencil and bring it out and cut completely free of the unit. I'm a little tired of putting my fingers into that tiny space and cutting with a knife and all that jazz. I will say that once you do that, it can be very difficult to pick up that tiny piece of paper and put it back into that space. So getting it in there is not too much of a challenge in this case, but it can be if it sticks to your fingers or won't get straight. So I'm grabbing a pair of pliers and I'm pulling off some of the excess hot glue that was on the bottom of that piece. And now I'm wrapping the baseboard around this column to hide some of that hot glue. You should keep in mind that the white glue isn't really gonna adhere to the hot glue. So if you have some trouble with that, you're going to have to make adjustments. Now this time I'm showing you what happens if you don't score the edge. And if you don't score that edge, what's going to happen is that when you try and wrap it around, as you can see here, it's going to get very pudgy. And that pudge or that edge is not going to look nice or want to stay smooth. So that is why you need to score each of these edges, so that you can make sure all of your lining pieces will lie flat. Be careful when you're cutting without a corkback ruler. Again, some of these detail pieces, I cut a lot of things freehand, and I also use my square ruler to really push and smooth out those cuts so that they're nice and easy. We're gonna move on to some other details after a short break. All right, so we're going to continue with our decorative pieces, and we have a few decorative pieces to go on this guy here, but our big thing that we're going to have to contend with is our newel posts, our handrail, and our balusters. Now, one of the easiest ways that you can do your balusters is using something that's already pre-manufactured. So a toothpick is great because it's already a cylinder, and you can cut off, and you can cut them relatively easily. But if you have these specific toothpicks, they're decorative on the end, and so they have just a little bit of interest, and that gives you something to look a little bit more interesting than just a plain toothpicks. But you can decorate your toothpicks if you choose. So you can use wire or anything you would like to make your toothpicks look more interesting than just plain toothpicks if you choose to have a different decoration. The other thing is that you can use other things around the house to feel like you can get little details into your pieces. For example, beads make really good doorknobs and small decorative items on any model that you might be making. So we are going to go ahead and cut a few more of these strips to use on, well, it looks like we just need some of our thinner ones for over here up at the top, and to go ahead and continue gluing those around. I actually do already have one here, so I can continue gluing that around over here. Now for this piece down here, I'm actually going to make a little plate, a little triangle, so that I can have that decorative piece available. So I'm going to come in here, and I know that that's 1 foot by 1 foot, so I'm going to make it just a little bit bigger so that it overlaps the edge. Like this. This would be a nice little square to cap off the edge of my piece. And I can do it like this, or I can do a couple more squares in order to stack up that dimension to look like something decorative. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make one that's a little bit smaller. And a little bit more than that. And then I will just put a little bead on the end right there. All right. Speaking of little beads, I have a few other sizes as well as the sizes that I have over there. So I'm going to go ahead and pop this open and just look for a different size. And I think what I want to go ahead and do is grab a pair of angle tweezers, and I think that this is a really good size for a doorknob. And then because that's gold, I'm going to go ahead and pull out some other gold pieces. Now, I don't absolutely have to use gold pieces, I can paint them later, but I'm just going to go ahead and pull out these to be decorative. And I'm going to pull out 5 that match. I'm going to look and see if I have anything bigger. I don't. If you don't have these beads at your disposal, that's absolutely fine. You can either add a little decorative element there or not. It's completely at your discretion. But one of the things that can be very useful is having the picture of that on hand. So I have 2 little stripes of decoration over here, a stripe of decoration at the bottom here. So I'm going to go ahead and cut those pieces and add them, and I'm also going to put the bead right here on the end. Now, if I was concerned about making sure that I didn't get them painted, I could absolutely wait until the piece is all the way painted before I added those beads. But I'm going to live dangerously and add that bead right now. I am also going to live dangerously on this door and add a bead as well. Now you can add that blue directly to the surface, or you can add it to your bead, and you want to make sure you put it on the side of the door that opens. If you put it on the side of the door that has the hinge, that's not much use in a real door. Okay. So I have those, and now the other 4 beads that I pulled out, I'm going to be putting them on our newel posts here. So again, in our last piece, in our last video, I went ahead and made those newel posts out of chipboard or mat board, and I made them out of that mat board as a square, and I constructed them very similarly to how I constructed these posts. But instead of doing that this time, I'm going to layer them on top of each other. So I measured the wrong thing. I want to first cut out a piece that's the height I want them to be. So I want them to be this high. That's how high I want them to be. And so I'm going to cut this off right at that line. Now, this doesn't end on an even line with my cutting mat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it on a line, and now I know this side does not line up. But as long as I get this edge flush with that line on my mat, really nice and careful, then I know that I'm cutting square, and I'm lining this edge up with the line on the cutting mat. So I'm going to go ahead and ignore these lines. These are from another thing that we cut out, and I'm going to cut out another slice like this. Just going to score it with my knife instead of using my pencil because it's a little bit more exact. It also gives me the valley that I'm going to be cutting in already, so I don't have to worry about measuring quite as much. And now these guys, I'm going to cut each of them into 1/4 inch strips. And instead of cutting the different sides and looking at arranging it like I did before, I'm just going to make 3 layers of this mat board. So I'm essentially going to cover this. I'm going to make the whole thing a full thickness, like a full density of the material. It does seem like it uses more material, but I get to cut a slightly bigger piece. And by cutting a slightly bigger piece, it's usually a little bit easier to actually cut. Okay. I want to remind you that cutting small pieces is always easier when you're cutting them off a larger chunk. So these pieces would be much easier to cut if we were cutting them off something larger. So I'm going to go ahead and put glue on 2 of them. And then I'm just going to smush and smush these together. Now one of them is just a little bit larger than the other 2. I want to make one edge, if I can, completely smooth. And I want to press it down. And the reason I want to make at least one edge completely smooth is that then it will line up to the mat. And I will be able to take my knife and come in and trim this bottom piece to match. Once it matches, I have one newel post ready to go. So I think that I already have a piece cut, and I do. And this is a nice decorative piece that I'm going to wrap around the bottom and the top. And it's the same height for both. So I'm going to glue it down on one side and hold it till it gets tacky. And this I'm going to do the same as when I wrap it around the model. I'm just going to score, glue, score, press, score it again, press it over again, and do it one more time. I want to remind you that anytime you're not using the corkback ruler to make a cut, you want to be very, very careful because your blade is quite sharp, and you want to pay attention to what you're doing. Now, I don't, in general, recommend making cuts without the corkback ruler at all, but sometimes you're going to have to do them. This one right here, you're not going to be able to get a ruler in there. But you can get as close as you possibly can, and you can be very careful. I'm going to do the same thing on this side and make another piece on top. Gently. Right here, I'm just scoring. I'm not actually cutting that piece. And then I'm going to press and hold with a good amount of pressure to really get that glue to seep in. And once again, score, turn and press, score, turn and press. And this last one I get to turn and cut. And this time I'm not so much worrying about dragging through as I'm just pressing down and then moving my knife and pressing down. And there we have a newel post. And I can also come in and add our ball on the top, our decorative ball. So we have that right there. So I'm just going to make that a couple more times, and this one over here I'm going to make halfway. So I'm just going to make out of some of those materials. So I've already glued a piece together, and I'm going to cut it down to the size we need to make a few more of these. So once I have all of these cut and ready to go, I'm going to start attaching them to the wall here. Now this one right here is a half one that's going to go right up against the wall. If you decide to do your handrail on both sides, you can do that as well. This one, I'm going to do the same thing we did with some of our other pieces, which is I'm going to put both sets of glue on it and anchor it right here. I want to try and make sure that this is as straight up and down as possible. And you know what? I actually am I'm gonna skip the hot glue, because the handrail is something that needs to be very sturdy. And hot glue is actually not a very strong glue at all. It's quick drying, but it doesn't actually provide a lot of stability. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut these pieces and set them here. And I'm going to put them as square as I possibly can. And I'm not going to touch them for quite a while. I'm going to let this dry. I'm going to let this dry completely. And because I've got some pretty good cuts on the mat board, they're standing pretty straight up and down. This guy over here needs a little assistance, but they're looking pretty good and they're looking pretty consistent, and I'm going to leave them like that. I'm not going to touch them. I'm going to work on this guy over here and getting a little bit in there, but I'm going to try very hard not to touch over here at all. And immediately unsuccessful. So I'm going to glue that back down. But I'm going to try and let this sit and get tacky and get nicely glued down all on its own without me bothering it so much. So while I'm waiting for that, I'm going to go ahead and cut a few more pieces of, I'm waiting for that to tack up. I'm going to cut a few more pieces of the trim that's going to go around the window and the door. So I'm going to cut a few more straight 4-inch slices. I'm going to do them in the short direction. I don't need them in the long direction, and I don't quite have enough room on the table for them to go in the long direction right now. So I'm going to go ahead and cut a couple of those while I'm waiting. And I'm also going to, I have this little thin strip, which should be enough, but I'm going to start constructing what I want to do for my top molding. And for my top molding, I have a couple choices. In the example that we did, what I do on the top is actually pre-manufactured molding that you can buy and arrange into a piece. But if you want to make more complicated molding, I'm going to show you a little bit how you can do that here. And that is by gluing a bunch of pieces together. And you basically construct it the same way that you construct real molding for large-scale scenery pieces, which is you stack stuff on top of other stuff. So that is one of the reasons I want to show you how to do it. That doesn't mean that you have to do this molding all the way around for your piece, but if you want to, you are welcome to. So I'm going to take a few of these pieces, and what I would do is create a silhouette of our board. So right here, there's a little tiny piece of pre-manufactured molding right here, and what's here and here is actually foam core or mat board or crescent board. So if I wanted to create this, I could do a couple different things, but what I would probably do is take this piece, which is a nice sturdy size, and take a 1/4-inch strip. This is just below a foot, which is about how much our molding is. And I'm going to construct a piece of molding by placing this on top. Now, I could use a combination. And what I mean by that is I have this other piece of molding, or this other piece of material, and make it a different size. And now, instead of doing this piece on top of that piece, I'm going to take this medium piece, go in between, glue that to that, and then glue this on top. As soon as I can get a grip on the jumping beam. And then you could do yet another line. Of this on top. And you could construct quite a bit of this molding till you had enough that you wanted to construct your piece. Now when you do that, you'll go ahead and cut a nice square flush edge and then go to measure how much you need. Now let's go ahead and make this kind of a cap on here. And if I do that, well actually there's some that would go right here inside this area. So inside that area is really hard for me to reach with that piece. So I need to make it 2 real inches. So So I need to record what those 2 real inches are and then transfer that measurement and cut it out. So this, I'm just going to do a nice square piece, 2 inches. And then I'm able to glue and place this guy in. And that will look quite attractive and be very nice right there. Now, one more glue. Press that in. Wait for it to tack up for a second. But where it gets more complicated is when I want to go, let's say, around this top piece. So what I need to do that is make that 45-degree cut. So I want to cut this at 45 degrees, and then the inside edge, I want to cut this last one at 45 degrees too. So if I want to cut this last one at 45 degrees, I can do the same thing I did before, try and cut that 45-degree angle. But it's a little bit harder to do with it being so high like this. Also, I didn't put a copious amount of glue on this piece, so I'm going to have to glue it back together. That is my bad. I'm going to glue those 45s back together so that it looks correct. And then I would place this back on here. Like so. And once I do one side, I would just keep going until I go all the way around. Now the thing you're going to have to remember is that this 45-degree angle is not going to do you any good. You're going to have to refresh that 45 in the other direction. So I'm going to hold it right along those dots, get a nice fresh 45-degree angle, and try again. Mark it. Doing that on the bottom there because I want to, I need to pay attention to which way I'm going to go. I'm going to make that on the short side there. Then I would be cutting the angle this way, and that's a little awkward to do from this angle. So I'm going to turn it this way. Same issue. What am I missing? I'm not going to be able to get all my ideal factors, which is I like to keep the top of it on the mat, if at all possible, so that issue with the top falling off doesn't happen as much. But once you go to glue it back on, you want to make sure that you get glue in this joint right here. And press that guy in place. You want to make sure every time you come up to a corner where you're going to need to make this type of adjustment, you evaluate whether you need a piece cut in this direction or not. Now, for example, if I'm doing this corner over here, I'm going to need this corner cut just like it is, this interior corner cut just like that it is. But this exterior corner is going to come out at this 45-degree angle. So I'm going to come back down, come in here, make sure my interior at that angle, and then cut. Requires a pretty sharp blade to do that as well. And that is my very dimensional piece of molding. Now, if you don't want to make this very elaborate dimensional piece of molding, you can always just use a flat piece so that it's not as intricate. While you're doing these detailed pieces though, you want to, while you're doing those detailed pieces though, you want to make sure you're being as careful as you can to get them to match and look correct, because as they meet up to each other, you want them to be the same. So I'm going to go ahead and cut a few more pieces of this out and make a few more pieces of molding matching this little guy I've got over here. Well, these completely tack up, and I'm also going to add my little pieces of molding up in here, and then I'll be back. And I'm back. So I cut out this little 2-inch piece to go on the other side here. Just a little bit too big. So I guess my math was just a little bit wrong. There we go. And I'm gonna go ahead and put this glue on it. I'm also gonna put a dab of hot glue here and here, and that will keep this from shifting too much. Once I press it in and keep it clamped in just a little bit, so that will keep it nice and tight. So I'm gonna continue with this piece up here. I'm gonna add that 45-degree angle in. No, actually, yeah, that's what I'm gonna do. Now, just have to check and see. I'm probably going to have to reduce the size of this piece vertically just a little bit. Now I can also flip this upside down and set it on top to be able to see, so that I can make a mark. Yep. And it's a little tiny bit small. I'm just going to take a little bit off the bottom out, and then drive it again, and that fits. So I'm going to glue, because the delicate nature of this piece, I'm going to glue it. My post-it note situation is getting a bit trying over here. What I usually do is take a post-it note and stick it to the mat, and then set this right on top of that post-it note. And the slight stick of the post-it note keeps the hot glue gun or keeps the paper in place, so that every time I pick up the hot glue gun, it doesn't come with it. But occasionally that starts to run awry. So back here, I want to do another tour around this piece. I only need to do 3 sides, and I want to do that with a little bit thinner of a piece, because I'm gonna run into the tops of the walls. So I'm just gonna go ahead and cut off the rest all the way down, and then I'm gonna just cut to fit this piece here. Again, just a dab of hot glue to keep that nice and fluid, nice and still. That's the better way of saying it. Once again, I'm going to come in and I'm going to change the direction of the 45 degree angle. And then what I want to do is come in real close and mark that like that. There we go. Do that again where I just do a double glue, one to hold for the long term, one to hold for the short term. I'm just going to take a little bit more off the bottom because that front side is not looking like it wants to go all the way down. And now I have the advantage that I get to square off one side. I'm going to square off this side right here. And then mark my diagonal there. And then let's be even shorter on the side like that. Alright. There we go. Both sides. Now I will hot glue. The hot glue is particularly nice for the gap in between the two pieces. So this corner piece right here. If I hot glue there and squeeze it out, it'll hot glue in here and squeeze it out. It'll actually fill in that gap a little bit. Now I don't want it to stay like that. So now I need a tiny little decorative piece here. And I happen to know that that is 2 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and cut it 2 inches. And I think I'm going to do one bigger piece right here. I'm going to make that nice and steady. I'll do it again over here. I'm using that glue line I had there before. I don't want it to touch that arch completely. I want it to be just above that arch on both sides. Yeah. There we go. And so now all we need is our handrails and our balusters. So I'm going to grab some 1/4 inch stuff, material, measure, mark, and cut. Now these ones here, I'm going to want to do 45 degree angles on them. So I'm going to start with a nice 45. And then I'm going to come down to here. And that's going to be a 45 degree angle this way. I'm going to double check that this fits in here. Oh, lovely. Yes, it does. Now I'm just going to make one exactly the same instead of trying to remeasure. If you're having trouble when trying to do this straight down cut, the straight down 45 degree cut, one of the things you want to try and do is take your knife and kind of saw forward and down instead of trying to go straight down. And you might get this kind of diagonal cut, this kind of diagonal shape if you're not able to keep your knife straight, but you may be able to correct that a little easier. So now I have all these pieces ready to go, and I've let these dry nice and securely with really good glue so that they're ready to go. And now is where I let you in on the information I'm about to tell you, which is I could absolutely be very careful and deliberate and make sure that when I glue the next pieces on, I do them with regular glue and I just reinforce them with hot glue, and they will be stronger if I do that. However, that is unlikely to be easy to do. when you're doing these pieces with the spindles inside of them, it is very intricate and you're going to have to hold them for a long period of time. So not using an instant glue or hot glue or something like that is going to be a lot more difficult. Now, one of the things you can do is you can use super glue. So I'm going to show you how to use super glue in just a second with accelerant to put these on, but I'm also just going to use some good old-fashioned hot glue. So I'm going to set this on its side, and I'm going to go ahead and mark these to fit, and I want to cut it along this line right here, and then hold it down and take my knife and press into it. The knife creates a valley, and this is an opportunity where if you have some diagonal cutters or a pair of scissors, those are very useful in this particular enterprise, because you don't have to worry quite as much as about having a flat end. If you have some cutters or something that's meant to cut this angle in wood, it can be useful. If you do cut with diagonal cutters like I just did on this, which is very useful, it does make a pointed edge, so using regular glue can be a little fishy. So I'm going to use a pair of angled pliers, and I'm going to stick this under just like that. And then I'm going to do that again and again and again. I'm going to do this side in hot glue, and then I'll do the other side in super glue, and I'll be back. Now that, in many ways, is the hard bit, because this bit is going to be a little bit more evenly cut, and even heights, and even arrangement, so it's going to be a little bit easier, at least for me, to do. Now that I've done that, I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2, 4. Okay. All right. So now I'm going to dig out my super glue. Okay. So super glue comes in different brands and different styles, and there are many different types of super glue out there. But one of the ones that I use more frequently is this brand right here, the BSI, Bob Smith Industries, and it comes in this blue and red, which is the actual cyanoacrylate super glue, and this right here is a debonder. So if you get your fingers stuck together or you want to debond something that you've glued together, you can use that. I'm going to set that aside for a second. And then this is the accelerant, and it will allow you to instantly set a great deal of your stuff. So I'm going to do the same general procedure where I am going to sit this down and I'm going to mark it and then trim it. And then I'm going to take some super glue. I'm going to put a dab of super glue on either side. I'm going to stick it in place. Now I'm going to hold it for a couple seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And instead of holding it for a couple seconds, I could have sprayed it with super glue accelerant. Now, if it isn't obvious, that spray definitely soaked in to the mat board itself. So it isn't something that you want to do if your material can't take the liquid. And as I do several of these, you're going to notice that the more of them I do, the more liquid accelerant will be on the surface. Now, if you can, one of the things you can do is you can go ahead and take your accelerant and put it on your surface already, and then you won't need to spray it. But I'm going to have to put a dollop of super glue on both sides. In case it isn't obvious, you do not want your bottle of super glue anywhere near where you are going to be spraying your accelerant. And then, if at all possible, you want to keep your accelerant close by, because sometimes you can be having a little bit of a hard time getting things to hold together, and then you need to give it a quick spurt so that it stays where it's going to stay. I'm actually, to prevent this guy from rolling around on me and moving where I don't want him to move, I'm going to take a 1, 2, 3 block, weigh it down right here, so this way my staircase itself isn't going to move around on me. I could also tape it to the table. I could do a lot of things. But I'm going to use that weight to just help me keep this guy in place. This time, when I'm cutting, I'm being real careful to get as exact as I possibly can, because one of the disadvantages, or advantages, of hot glue is that it physically leaves a blob. And because of that, I can glue smaller. I can cut a little smaller, and the glue will fill that gap. The super glue doesn't really want to fill that gap nearly as much as the hot glue does, although it will fill the gap a little bit. Ooh. Now, if you're not careful, you'll block the camera with your hand. If you're not careful, you will not be able to hold it in place. But the advantage of the not instant cure, some people ask, why don't you just get super glue that cures? Excuse me, that this stuff smells great, and I'm spraying it kind of close to my face. So why don't you just get super glue that dries faster? Why do you use accelerator instead? And the honest answer is, as you notice here, I'm taking it and I'm putting it on the piece, and then I'm using several seconds to get it in place and exactly where I want it to be before I hit it with the accelerator. Whoop. And that would normally give me the advantage of being able to place it and move it around. I don't think the super glue has set, so I'm gonna have to do it again. And this time I'm gonna be a little bit faster because I think there's accelerator on the toothpick. So as you stick it on there, sometimes you want it to stick right away, sometimes you want the repositioning ability, sometimes you don't want the reposition ability. It all depends on the thing you're gluing together. And this is just one example. I skipped one. One of the advantages though is that once I do this, once I put the accelerator on and that super glue is cured, it does take a little while to get fully cured. It's not quite, it's mostly cured right now, but it's not all the way cured. What happens is, well, that cut out while I was recording, but I was just super gluing these guys in here, and what happens is sometimes the super glue doesn't touch both sides and it can fall out, or if the pieces aren't cut in the right length, or if you have a little accelerant on a surface, it can dry before it attaches to another surface. But it can be useful to have accelerant on one side and your glue on your piece, and then when you stick them together, it sticks. Now, The downside is you want to make sure all of your other pieces are reinforced before you start spritzing it, because it could warp your piece. Now that is our last structural piece. If you're thinking to yourself, hey, there's not a piece right here, you're right. Neither of the physical examples have a piece right there, because you don't have to put a piece there. If you watched all the instructions and took some careful attention to do that, you can not do this little bit right here, and that's perfectly fine. I do want to mention that this was not the last thing I did. I realized there was no frame here or here, and I went ahead and put those in, but I did it just the same way as we did the frame for the door and other things you did earlier on. So it's no big deal. But this is the end of the physical building of our model piece, and then we will paint it. I'll see you there.